Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to our conversation today on Christian Union Ireland. We're joined by a very special guest, and we're going to talk a little bit about evangelism today. My name is Luke Sherwin. I'm a relay worker in the north of Ireland, in Belfast in particular, with Queen's CU. And I'm joined by Hannah.
Hi, everybody. If I haven't met you yet, my name's Hannah, and I'm a staff worker in Cork in the very, very south of the Republic of Ireland. And I'm originally from the north, as you'll probably be able to tell, originally from Tyrone. But yeah, been down in Cork for a little over a year now. And I work with Christian unions in the Munster area, so Cork, Limerick, Tralee, Thurles.
Superb. And I'm not only joined by Hannah today, we're joined by a very special guest, and that is Becky Pippert. We're so excited to have her here. And Becky, would you mind introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about who you are, where you come from? And that would be great.
Wonderful. Well, I am Becky Pippert. I am my ministry, and I would say my husband and I do this together, but we have an evangelism ministry where I do evangelistic talks to unbelievers and a lot of equipping and evangelism for believers. I have written a number of books, and right now I'm talking to you from our home in Michigan, which is in the Midwest. So we are a chilly day in Michigan today.
Oh, not so bad. It's probably, I would bet it's not as bad a day as in Cork. We've had like significant flooding in the high street today, and yeah, autumn in Ireland. Um, yeah, Becky, you don't just have connections with the States, do you? You have some connections with our island over here. So do you want to tell us about your experience being over here and how you're linked?
Oh, I'd be delighted. We lived in the UK recently for 7 years, and the first 3 years were in Northern Ireland. We were based there, right outside of Belfast. And we used that as the base, and then we did ministry throughout the UK and throughout a tremendous amount of the continent in Europe. And so we did, and I was in the Republic a lot, did conferences and talks a lot to students. So our ministry was kind of to students and to the church, but we fell in love with Ireland. Oh my gosh. We love that island so much. We did 3 years there, then we did 3 years in Oxford, and then 1 year in London. But we are just have tremendously close friends in Ireland and love it.
Super. I'm so glad to hear that. It's a place very close to my heart, and I'm glad it's very close to yours as well. You've mentioned a lot about evangelism so far in this conversation, and we've said already that this talk is about evangelism. But why, Becky, are you so passionate about evangelism, and why have you developed so much material on this subject?
Well, Luke, I would say my passion is Jesus, and evangelism is just the overflow. When you fall in love with Jesus, how can you not talk about him? What he's done in our lives, his faithfulness, how he never gives up on us, how he continues to graciously show us our sin where we need help, not to condemn us, but to enable us to become all that we're meant to be. You know, when I wasn't raised in a Christian home, I was the first person to come to Christ. And I remember when I was an agnostic and I was really investigating faith, and I went, oh, if I give my life, if I really surrender my life, would I even recognize myself? You know, what kind of person would I turn out to be? And the wonderful news of the gospel is that Jesus Christ transforms us and makes us more ourselves than we ever dreamed possible. How can you not want to talk about him? So that's where the passion comes from.
Great, yeah. Yeah, and it's very easy to see the our passionate Becky. Yeah, it's really exciting, and it's great to be able to chat to you about that today. But obviously, we find ourselves right now in the end of 2020 in very different circumstances to a year ago. So yeah, how does that change your perspective? Or have you found it difficult to be passionate or to be helping people with evangelism during this whole COVID thing?
Well, the first thing I want to say is on the nature of catastrophe. Catastrophes have always given the church, given us as Christians, tremendous opportunities for the gospel. Why? Now, obviously, the difficulty with COVID is okay. So how are we going to meet non-Christians? How are we going to talk to them? Obviously, social media is one way, but this isn't going to last forever. But catastrophe is actually a real opportunity for the gospel. Why? What catastrophe in any form has always done throughout history is that it sort of lifts the fog, if I can put it that way, and it reveals we aren't in charge. We're not in control. And this is the interesting thing about why we should be encouraged about living in such a secular culture. Now I realize, in Europe, UK, you've been living in a secular culture for probably longer than we have in America. But boy, let me tell you, we're really catching up fast. And what our post-Christian, postmodern, post-truth culture has not prepared us for is something like COVID. I think that's why the anxiety and the depression and all of that is so high, because we've been able to avoid looking at our mortality, for example. We assumed in this kind of culture we're living in now, we've always assumed, well, I can find my own identity. I can solve my own problems. I'm the master of the universe. And all of a sudden we're starting to see, wait a minute, in fact, an agnostic friend called me pretty early in the COVID thing, and we've had many talks about faith. And she said, Becky, I always assumed, as I told you, I'm the master of my destiny. But when a simple microscopic organism can bring our entire planet to a halt, it really shows how vulnerable we are. And she said, I've never seen with more clarity, I'm not in control. Because if I am God, and this is a really interesting thing, she said, because if I am God, why do I need to be taking pills for anxiety? And she said, truth be told, I make a lousy God. And I said, oh, so do I. I said, that is exactly right. For the first time, she is open to exploring the Christian faith, and particularly open to do a seeker Bible study with me virtually. So what we've got to recognize is God can use this time more than we ever imagined in the time of COVID, because people are asking questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's great. A good few years ago, Becky, you wrote a book called Out of the Salt Shaker, and it's gone down so well, and it's a very well respected book on the topic of evangelism. So now we come to the modern day, and you've just written a new book called Stay Salt. Here, I have it here.
I just happen to have mine.
No way. And there's Hannah's as well. But it's also on the topic of evangelism.
Yeah.
Why on earth would you write another book on evangelism, even though you've written one already a good few years ago on the same topic?
Because the times have changed. When I wrote Out of the Salt Shaker, it was a very different world. I wrote it a long time ago. It was just a very different kind of time where and today, what's changed? Well, our culture has changed. The impact of postmodernity in the West has absolutely been amazing. Well, what are some of the changes? There's the collapse of absolute truth, the belief in absolute truth, the idea that we don't believe in authority anymore. It's now personal preference. That you can pick and choose your beliefs, cafeteria style, like, oh, I'll take a little karma here and a little bit of this there. The sexual revolution, oh my goodness, that wasn't, anyway, those are just some of the tremendous differences. The view of evangelism is also different. When I wrote Out of the Salt Shaker, the main idea was, pick a victim, go and preach and leave so that they can't contaminate you, and maybe influence your own faith. The emphasis was all on truth. Now that's not a bad thing, but the emphasis was on truth, not on relationship. Evangelism was seen in a very formulaic way, and that you said the same thing all to whomever you were speaking to. It didn't matter how different people were, you said the same thing. So when I wrote Out of the Salt Shaker, it was sort of, I think the reason why it had such an impact is because I began talking about the need to communicate truth, but in the context of relationship. And I looked very carefully at who Jesus was and what was his style. What did he do? So in the past, the view of a relationship was strong on truth, weak on relationship. What has happened today? I think in the West generally, because we've done evangelism training all over the world, is that it's now become very much stronger on relationship, but really weak on truth, weak on any verbal expression of faith. And so one of the things I always hear, now I don't know that I heard this so much when I was living in the UK, but I hear it a lot in America. And we've only been back about 2 years, but what I always hear is Christians saying, well, I believe the way that I can be a witness is of living the gospel. Just living the gospel and letting people see. Because as St. Francis of Assisi said, preach the gospel and if necessary, use words. Now, first of all, there is no historical evidence that Assisi ever said that. And if he did say it, he was wrong. Because that is not what biblical evangelism is. Simply demonstrating the gospel and nothing else.
Yeah, I've heard that quote a lot as well.
Yeah.
It's definitely not a thing just in the States. No, that's very common. The idea of show the gospel and if necessary, or teach the gospel and if necessary, use words. So on that note then, you've mentioned there biblical evangelism, and the fact that you looked into like what Jesus did and that sort of thing, and that was a big part of what you did. So is there a biblical type of evangelism if everything's changed? Like, what's the biblical route? How would you describe biblical evangelism?
Yeah, Hannah, that's a good question. What is biblical evangelism? I think biblical evangelism is three things. It is visual. It's not that we must not live the gospel, demonstrate the gospel. Really, it's two things in this visual department. It is being who I am, that I am demonstrating the fruit of the Spirit, not perfectly, but being what a Christian really is. But it's also doing, and this is where justice comes in. Justice, you hear about justice all the time in the States, that we have to demonstrate justice, but it often limits us to that's all it is. But there is the visual. Secondly, there's the verbal, and that's where we're so weak in the West. We are to share the glorious news of Jesus Christ, the hope that is within us. So that's the telling aspect. Thirdly, it's invitational. It's calling people at the right time in the right place to put their trust in Jesus as Lord and Savior. So it's visual, it's verbal, it's invitational.
Seems quite clear. It seems quite clear what it might be. But why do you think people don't tell people about Jesus? What is
Yeah.
holding them back?
Oh my gosh, I've asked myself that question so many times. And again, we spent 7 years, as I said, in the UK and Europe. But before that, we had 8 years where we were literally traveling all over the world, everywhere. And so it was a fascinating thing to see what's the problem. One of the things is that we're afraid. What if they ask me a question and I don't know the answer? Well, people asked Jesus a question and he didn't know the answer. They said, when are you returning? And he said, I don't know. That is what my Father in heaven knows. I don't. Now, if Jesus had been behaving like us, what would he do? Oh my goodness, I don't know. This is so embarrassing. Don't tell anybody I didn't know. No. What we need to do when people ask us questions is go, what a fantastic question. I haven't a clue what the answer is, but I can't wait to find out. Thank you for asking that. You affirm the question. Now, another thing you can do, by the way, somebody's asking you a question and you don't know, just do a little bit of, can you tell me why that question is so important to you? Can you help me understand it? Gives you a little more time to think. You also find out why it's important to them. But that's one thing. A second thing is, what if I offend? Now, that's a very legitimate fear. What if I offend? Here's the part that amazes me. We are so afraid of offending. Why don't we tell non-Christians that? What I have said to my non-Christian friends is, look, I am so excited about being a Christian. I am so excited about Jesus and what he's done, but I don't like Bible bashers. So if I'm coming on too strong, if I'm not listening, if I'm offending, would you tell me? Just let me know. It's amazing to me that it never occurs to us to ask that question. So we're afraid we don't know the answer. We need to be real. We need to be authentic. And most non-Christians, they're not horrified we don't know the answer. They appreciate our authenticity. We tell them that we don't want to offend. We don't want to be insensitive. Now, I don't mean offense of the gospel. That's different. But I mean offending by our style. Okay, there's other fears, but that's one. The thing that I probably hear the most beyond that, and this is actually how I shaped the book, Stay Salt, is that I hear 3 things all the time about resistance to sharing their faith. The first is, every conference I've ever done, people will come up and it's like they're sharing their deepest, darkest secret that they hope nobody ever finds out. And they go, Becky, listen, I would love to share the gospel, but I can't. Why? Because I'm inadequate. And this is news. I mean, that's why I say to them, well, of course you're inadequate. I'm inadequate. We're all inadequate. The only adequate one is God. That is what is so fascinating to me about this deep shame we have about our inadequacy. Or people will say, well, it's just not my gift. I just don't have the gift of the evangelist. Or, Becky, I'm not an extroverted American. I heard that all the time in the UK, like you. I mean, I just don't have the right personality for it. What does the Lord say? The Lord commanded us, and the risen Lord, before you ascended into heaven, said, go ye therefore and make disciples of all the nations. Now, did you notice Jesus did not say this? Go ye therefore, all you extroverts, all you gifted evangelists, okay, and all of you with dynamic communication skills, go and make evangelists, okay, and we'll throw in the clergy. The rest of you, just hang out, sing some hymns, I'll be back. It's not what the Lord said. He said, go ye therefore, all of you. We're not called, not everybody is an evangelist. Not everybody has that gift. He's not calling us to be an evangelist. He's calling us to be witnesses with the gifts we have, with the personality we have. So that's tremendously important. But here's another part in this first, in fact, the first section of my book deals with all these questions and stay salt. And that is this. God is the great evangelist, and he uses us in our weakness. You know, when Paul had his thorn on the flesh, and he went to the Lord 3 times. And what did he say? Please get rid of this. I don't like, in other words, he said, I don't like being weak. I just get rid of it. And what did the Lord say? The Lord said, Paul, my power is made perfect in your weakness. And what does Paul say? Well, all right then. I'm going to start celebrating my weakness, not just accepting it begrudgingly. I'm going to celebrate my weakness because he says, God is glorified in my own weakness. Paul refused to be ashamed about it. And then he says, for when I am weak, then I am strong. So that's the first thing, is that we have got to recognize that we have the Holy Spirit, we have the power of the Word of God, we have the love of Jesus. He's given us everything we need. That's the first thing. Second thing I always hear is, I just don't know enough about the gospel. So the first part of Stay Salt is, what are the means God has given to help us be effective? The second part of the book is, yeah, but what is the gospel? What is it we believe? What kind of pushback are we going to get from non-Christians? And how do I help connect the beauty of the gospel at whatever area, creation, if we're talking about creation, fall, redemption, the cross, resurrection, Christ's return, whatever I'm talking about with a non-Christian, how do I connect the beauty of the gospel with their own needs, with their own questions? And thirdly, what I always hear is, I just don't know how to do it. I don't know. So it's the means God has given us, the message, and the method. But by method, I don't mean formulaic. I don't mean technique. I mean, how do we communicate the gospel? How do we bring up the topic? How do we deal with very different kinds of people? What can we do when, well, golly, there's just so many things. It's too many to recall. But it's, how do I do it? How do I share the good news of Jesus? But throw in one more thing. This probably goes back to the first one, the means. The tremendous necessity of prayer. We need to pray and ask God, who's open? Who are you working? Lead me to that person. Help me. Prayer is absolutely foundational to evangelism.
Yeah, superb.
Yeah, Becky, on that note then of the means, what if people aren't like, okay, cool, I'm like this high flyer, I can do this great talk. What does it mean to be a witness in our day-to-day lives if we're not going around inviting our friends to listen to, here's my 15-minute pre-prepared apologetic talk on this question that you're all asking, friends?
I think there is a misunderstanding, again, biblically, of the strategy of evangelism, if I could put it that way. Evangelism begins in the personal. Personal evangelism is absolutely critical. And look at Jesus. When you look at Jesus, it's just amazing to see what he does, because he listens when he prays. He listens. He asks questions. He rouses curiosity. He never spoke the same way twice to people. He really, what he said, they're principles, but what he said was very much based on who they were. And and that's why when he was, the gospel's the same, but the way we introduce the topic of the gospel, as it were, depends on who we're talking to. To the woman at the well, he said, well, if you knew who you were talking to, you would know I can give you living water. You'd never have to come back to the well to draw water, etc. It's entirely based on what her problems were, who she was. Nicodemus in John 3, he's saying, I got to be born again. In other words, when you look at Jesus and you learn about personal evangelism, there isn't like 3 sets of questions you always ask everybody. There was no formula. All right, that's the first. Second, it's not just personal, it's small group evangelism. Now, this is where seeker Bible studies are so powerful. I wrote the first Uncover when I was living in the UK and training and teaching students, all right, in personal evangelism and then in small group evangelism. How do we invite our non-Christian friends to say, take a look. Have you ever, one of the things I always say to the students is, why don't you say something like, you really have, you're bright. I really like your questions. They're really good. But I kind of have the impression that you've never actually read the primary source material. That's a great thing to say to college students. You probably wouldn't say it to church people. But we've got to read the material. How can you make an intelligent decision if you've never looked at what it says? Let me tell you something. Nothing is, apart from prayer and a real relationship, where we're really authentically involved with non-Christians, bring them as quickly as you can to take a look at Jesus and just say, well, let's take a look. You don't have to believe. You don't have to believe the Bible. You don't have to believe in God. You don't have to believe anything. But you can't make an intelligent decision and let you look and see what it says. And I'm telling you, Jesus is irresistible. Jesus is so powerful. We just saw so many students come to Christ when they were connected with a real Christian who was praying for them, having conversations, getting into secret Bible study. And then the third thing of strategy is proclamation. And this is where I found that you guys were far ahead of America. In terms of missions and evangelistic outreach. I mean, I was just blown away by how well you do it. But here's where you've got to be careful. And that is, I remember when the first year we came and lived in the UK, I was in Cambridge, and Tim Keller, a good friend of mine, had just done the mission at KICU.
Just drop that in there, like Tim Keller, friend.
My old bud, Sorry, didn't think about that name dropping. But so here's what I heard. I was listening to the students after, his brilliant talks, evangelistic talks, and they went, wasn't that fantastic? I wonder what KICU will do next year for evangelism. And I went, oh my goodness, there's the problem. And that is, we think is just, getting an evangelist to come, doing the talk, and then we just go back to our normal living. That is not what the Bible teaches. It is personal. It's that we are engaged ourselves with unbelievers. Then we bring them into a seeker study. And by the way, another thing, once you do a seeker study, invite them to Christianity Explored. Do that. Or Alpha. But those are evangelistic for the, for people that I think are a little bit farther along. I think a seeker study might be where you start, then you do the others, and then do the proclamation events. But let me tell you something. Proclamation events are not going to be drawn near the people they could if we're not engaged in personal evangelism first.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. You've mentioned briefly about how we often feel inadequate when it comes to sharing our faith and sharing the gospel. But then I found in my experience that quite often I find myself having a God complex where I think that I'm great. And I have this weakness in my life, but I'm not going to show that to anybody else. So I'll go to see you and I'll put on the tough persona. I'll never pretend, or I'll always pretend that nothing's going wrong. How can we encourage our students to be open and honest and vulnerable so that when people come along to see you, they don't see a bunch of fake people who are pretending, but they see real people that Jesus has impacted?
All right, very interesting question. And let me take it in 2 parts. When I write in Stay Salt about having a God complex, what that means is, I was talking to someone in the States, and we were flying from, we had a long flight, and she was very chatty and just really wanted to talk. And so we found, I always look, this is a little bit before your question, but you always look for common ground. What do we have in common so we can establish authentic relationships? Well, it turns out we were both world travelers and readers and love films. It's very easy to find common ground. When you find common ground is when people begin usually to start sharing their beliefs, their values or whatever. And so she starts and she goes, Becky, she said, if I want to be a woman on Monday and a man on Wednesday, who cares? It's totally my choice and my preference. Then she went on to a second thing. Then she went on to a third. And then she said, I really believe that human nature is good. And I said, well, and so I was thinking about, okay, where do I land on all these different beliefs? Whatever. So I said, so I took it away, the easier one. And I said, that's very interesting that you believe that human nature is good. What do you think about the state of the world? In other words, we don't come in and go, are you kidding me? Is that the stupidest thing I've ever heard? Check out human history. No, that's not what you do. But I said, can you tell me what you think about the state of the world? She went, oh, it's a mess. She said, this is pre-COVID. This is, the world is a mess. I went, okay, so help me out here. How can the world be a mess if we're all good people? She went, that's a very good question. She said, let me think. Now, she gave what I think is a very American analysis. She said, I think our basic problem is that people are either have an addiction problem and they need recovery, or they're psychologically wounded and need therapy. Don't you agree? I said, well, I agree that those things have helped people, but I've got another question. What if we get over our immediate addiction, or we're living in recovery from our immediate addiction, and then we find out and realize that we have a deeper addiction than we ever realized. We're addicted to ourselves. How do you get over that? And she went, whoa, boy, I tell you what, I'm addicted to myself. But she said, oh my gosh, she said, if an addiction problem, if we use recovery programs for addiction, who in the world can help us overcome if we're addicted to ourselves? And I said, it was the first time I mentioned God. I said, well, I tell you the truth. In my experience, I don't think anything can help us over our addiction to ourselves apart from God. In fact, that's what caused me to go from being an agnostic to eventually becoming a Christian, but that's a long story. She goes, I want to hear that story. And so I began sharing my faith. Now she says to me, Becky, does the Bible say anything about why we're addicted to ourselves? And I said, yes. I said, now this isn't quite the language they use, but they describe it as having a God complex. We get ourselves and God confused. She went, well, let me tell you what. I have a God complex. I'm getting myself and God confused. I'm not sure God exists, but I've always thought I'm in charge. And I said, we all struggle with a God complex. And that was exactly my problem as well. I said, now actually, that's what the Bible calls sin, is that we're confusing ourselves with God. And there began a profound conversation. Now, did you notice in that story, I tell the story in the book and I tell it at much greater length, but the first thing is, we need to identify that's the problem we have. We keep getting ourselves and God mixed up. And because we really make lousy gods, what we do is hide it and try and fake it and the smile and all of that. Okay, so what do we need to do as Christians? Number one, we need that authenticity you're talking about, Luke. We need, it doesn't mean you say every problem to everyone, but we need far greater genuineness and authenticity with our non-Christian friends, saying this is a problem we all have, myself included. And we need certainly to do it with each other. So I think one of the things that frees us to be more authentic is understanding the gospel and experiencing it. Luke, when you bring your sin to the Lord and you say, not only am I repenting, but I'm asking you, let me experience your forgiveness. The Holy Spirit comes and you begin to realize you are loved, you are forgiven, and the joy of that forgiveness is partly what frees us to be real. Let me tell you something, the world is looking for real. They're not looking for plastic smiles. So that's a rather long answer to your question, but there you go.
Yeah, that's really great. Yeah, and I know, like, on that note of kind of or forgiveness and or accepting the gospel ourselves, another thing you talk about, Becky, is just this fact that we are new creations and we've been transformed. And I know for myself and for a lot of my students, like, a lot of the time we don't necessarily feel like a new creation. Yeah, sometimes, like, especially when we're still struggling with sins that we maybe had in our sort of so-called past life, doesn't really feel very past. And yeah, we still struggle a lot with our guilt of our sin that we're still wrestling with. So how do we see as Christians that transformation that you talk about, and that transformation in our Christian lives?
Okay. One of the things, I've said it already, and as I was writing the middle part of my book on the gospel, I realized we have to fall in love with the gospel again and again and again. It is, there's the issue of how do you explain the gospel to non-Christians? And that is going to be a shorter version of the gospel. You know, their eyes are going to glass over if you spend a long, long, long explanation. But for us, we need to keep going deeper and deeper and deeper. And I tell you, when I was writing the book, I was overwhelmed by the gospel. There was times where I get on my knees and say, I never realized just how profound this is and how God meets us. So we ourselves need to be continually going deeper with what is the gospel. And I think the thing that most frees us is understanding the cross. I did all the training we do in evangelism, we actually put on video in London while we were living there. And it's called Empowered. And the first talk that I give in evangelism training is a talk on the cross. Because when you realize what it really means of what Christ did for us, of how he came, how he, that he took on our sin, that we can become free and righteous. I mean, it's such an amazing thing to really understand. And it gives us such freedom to talk with unbelievers. Because one of the things unbelievers don't like about us is that we can be holier than thou, kind of somehow seem spiritually superior. You cannot look at the cross and ever come to that conclusion. We all need forgiveness daily. So that's one thing, is that we need to understand the message. We need to understand the cross particularly. Second thing is, we don't do this alone. It's why we're called to church. It's why we're called to fellowship. And we're missing such an opportunity if we're not going deep in prayer and saying, here is where I really need help. This is where I want and I need to seek the Lord's forgiveness and overcoming and walking in the power of the Spirit. So it also is small groups, meeting in prayer, maybe with a small group, maybe with one other person. So I think that's where we start.
Superb. Becky, this has been an amazing introduction to this whole idea of evangelism and content within your book, and also the Empowered series, which we're going to be using over the next little while, and to encourage us in evangelism and give us a little bit more guidance as well. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you, Hannah, as well, and for being here. And I've loved it, and I hope that everyone watching has really enjoyed it as well. I look forward to chatting again soon about a little bit more practically how we can continue on in our evangelism. So thank you very much, Becky.
Thank you, Luke. Thank you, Anna.